So after Terence Crawford's unanimous decision win over Israel Madrimov last weekend, I think now is a perfect time to go over the whole landscape of matchmaking you can make for Crawford, from his division to the divisions above and the divisions below him. Now, there won't be too much talk about the higher divisions like middleweight and super middleweight because there's just too many fighters to go over. I've kept this to just 12 fighters who I think are very realistic opponents for Crawford in the future. As you can see from the tiers on screen, definitely beats Bud at the top would be a fighter I would bet money on to beat Crawford. Definitely beats Crawford. I'd be very, very surprised if Bud wins that fight. Strong chance, 50-50 matchups. We're talking about like elite opponents who I would not be surprised at all if Crawford lost those fights, but also not surprised if he won those fights. Decent chances opponents who are solid, good fighters, known good fighters who are... I'd be surprised if they beat Crawford, but I can see them taking rounds off, maybe making it close in some moments. Low chance is just... I'd be very surprised if they won that fight. It's not impossible. There's a possibility. And the no tier is for people who are not winning the fight whatsoever. You can bet your house on it. Crawford wins that fight. Now, our first placement has already fought Crawford, in fact, a few days ago, but he's on the list to sort of establish where the other fighters are in terms of their chances at winning. And we have Israel Madrimov. A lot of people were surprised by how close Crawford versus Madrimov was. I'm not going to lie and start saying stuff like, I saw it coming, I saw it being close. I didn't really see it being close. I thought I'd go the distance because, Crawford's first fight at 154. Madrimov is really good. He's very strong, very powerful. But to make it that close, I think, was a bit of an unexpected one for most people. But what I think is a stretch is the people that said Madrimov won that fight. I don't think Madrimov won that fight. I think draw's more fair than saying Madrimov won, but I find it hard to give Madrimov more than at least 6 rounds. I can't give him 6 rounds of that fight. So in terms of his chances versus Crawford, he's definitely on the higher end of the decent chance tier, because I wouldn't give it a 50-50 because we've seen Crawford win that fight. If they were to rematch, I think Crawford would win even clearer because he's that sort of fighter. Like you saw at the end of the fight, the later rounds were where Crawford was in his element. He was very, very comfortable in there. But he's good enough to the point where a big punch isn't out of the question. He's good, but he's a very good boxer. And I don't think Crawford will get enough credit for that win because I think that might be his best win on his record as of right now. Obviously, Errol Spence, good win on paper, but I don't think that was a very good version of Errol Spence, and that stylistically is a very Crawford-favoured matchup. Moving on to a fighter who I think is the one that people have been dying to see most, we have Jaron "Boots" Ennis. Now, Boots is in the 50-50 tier because I think for most fans, they've got the same sentiment in the idea that Boots is very capable of beating Crawford. That may depend on some factors. Boots is still an improving boxer. He's still a young boxer. And Buddy's he's 36 now, I believe. So we can only expect him to sort of slow down physically. We can only expect Boots to improve over time. So bearing those factors in mind, Boots winning the fight is very realistic. But obviously what tips the fight in favour of Bud is the fact that Boots still hasn't really sorted his defence out. Now, you can argue that Boots just went in there to knock out Avanesyan. He didn't care about defence. And I agree with you. He definitely did go for the knockout versus Avanesyan, sort of let his defence go a bit. And we've seen that before with Boots. We've seen it with Sergey Lipinets. He did the same thing. With his earlier fights, he got rocked doing the same thing. But as much as you can say that he wouldn't do that against Bud, it's hard to imagine there isn't a moment where he just sort of slips a little bit or lets his guard down a bit, because he's a naturally very cocky, quite flow state sort of fighter. I can't really see him being 100% defensively tight against Crawford. But he's very capable of winning the fight. He's one of the best athletes in boxing, I think. He's got one of the best jabs in boxing. Great footwork, great power. Really quick on his feet. which I think is a great weapon to use against Crawford. We saw Madrimov do well because of the footwork, in and out movement. But I think realistically I have to lean Bud because of the obviously difference of resume, difference of accomplishments, difference of comfortableness in the ring in their recent performances. Like, I don't think Bud goes the distance with Karen Chikadzian. Do you know what I mean? So, boots in the A tier. We move on to the least known fighter on this tier list. We have Bakram Murtazaliev. Now, this video might be split between people who know who Bakram Murtazaliev is and people who just don't know who he is. For a bit of background, he's the current IBF world champion right now at 154 pounds. Same division that Crawford's fighting in. The 4 belts right now, 2 of them are taken up by Sebastian Fundora. One's taken by Crawford and the last one is taken by Murtazaliev. Now, Murtazaliev is a champion because as a result of Jamel Charlo vacating his titles, Murtazaliev had to fight someone. Murtazaliev being the mandatory for the IBF belt, he just had to fight someone, anyone really, to gain the spot and win the vacant title. And his fight was with Jack Kulke, who, some of you might know, he's a German boxer. He lost to Demetrius Andrade a while ago. Lost to Sergei Dravianchenko. Decent fighter, not great though, a bit of a journeyman. And Murtazaliev had a really tough fight with Jack Kulke. That was a very tough fight for him. And he just about got through after being... technically, he was up on the scorecards, but scoring it live, Kulke was winning the fight. Murtazaliev gets the stoppage later on. However, would he beat Crawford? Obviously, the answer is no, not really. He's a very... For most of his career, he's been like ready to be exposed. He's one of those prospects where like, you think he's going to lose in his next fight, or like he might lose his next fight every time he takes a step up. That's the level we're talking about. I think the step up between Jack Kulke and Terence Crawford is so immense that we'd see just a one-sided affair. Crawford usually starts slow in his fights, but I don't think he would in this one. He'd just find... He'd win every second, basically, against Murtazaliev. That's an easy fight for him. Moving on to the current unified champion, 154 pounds, Sebastian Fundora. Now, technically, Fundora is the top dog at 154 pounds, so technically he should be a bit higher on the list, but realistically, no, he's not that good. I firmly believe that Tszyu would have beaten him without that massive cut on his forehead, because you saw how that first round was going. He was on his way to maybe a stoppage in that fight for Tszyu, so a bit of a fluke to get those titles, but, you know, he is good. He's a good boxer, and we know he's a good boxer. I think the only threat that he poses to Crawford really is just obviously his massive height. He is the sticking sex himself, Sebastian Fundora, so he would, as a physical presence, he would cause some problems for Crawford just in his ability naturally to grow into fights would be thrown off a bit because Crawford's not fought anyone remotely like Sebastian Fundora ever once in his career. So that'd be a bit of a hurdle to get around, but boxing-wise, we've seen many boxers land on Sebastian Fundora. A counter-puncher is Fundora's worst nightmare, really, and Crawford might be the best counter-puncher in boxing. So it's tough for Fundora to win that one. He's probably going to lose to Crawford if that fight happens. Now, moving on to a fighter who is rumoured to be fighting Sebastian Fundora next, we have Errol Spence Jr., the biggest name on Crawford's record. Now, what's always confused me about the rematch talks between Spence and Crawford is that there's an argument that Spence wasn't the same in their first fight as we used to see in the Errol Spence of old. But what confuses me is the fact that people believe that the second fight will be different. Like, my case for Spence, because I also believe that he was sort of damaged goods at that point. Like, I think the car crashes, all the damage sort of added up to him. He got dropped by a jab in that fight, in the first fight in the second round with a jab, right? That's a very bad look for a fighter's durability. So I do believe that Spence wasn't the same. But if anything's going to be different in the second fight, how? Because he would have taken more damage. He's going to be older. He's still got the same car crash injuries, right? I'm not sure how the second fight would play out any differently. Maybe the weight's a big thing, because Spence has been draining himself to make 147 for a long, long time. But I think we just saw boxing-wise how one-sided that matchup is. I think stylistically, it is a nightmare for Spence. And we saw Spence's punches have no effect on Crawford whatsoever. A fight with that level of confidence in a matchup going forward and Spence's lack of confidence in a second fight, I think it'd be a much more one-sided affair in the second fight, personally. I think it would end in the first 5 rounds, in my opinion. Silly talk about the rematch. Well, the fighter that people seem to be talking about the most in these matchups is Canelo Alvarez. Now, like most people, I'm going to firmly put him in the definitely beats Bud category. If Crawford knocked out Madrimov, easily, made it a routine victory, made him look like Errol Spence, made him look like David Avanesian, whatever, I'd see a case for it, because we've seen a smaller guy beat Canelo before. I don't think size is everything. Floyd Mayweather was a lot smaller than Canelo in their first fight. You can argue, Canelo was 23 years old. Devin Haney was 23 when he became undisputed. Teofimo Lopez was 23 when he beat Lomachenko. Age ain't really an excuse, really. The size was still a factor in that matchup, and Canelo still lost. But I think Crawford, he's not that quick on his feet, in my opinion, compared to someone like Floyd Mayweather. So I don't see him being able to sort of finesse the ring and escape. And the fact that Canelo's I think Canelo was a boxer who's very suited to bullying people, if you know what I mean. We saw that a lot in his run at 168 when he fought Callum Smith. Smith, much, much bigger than Crawford, by the way. He was just bullying around the ring for 12 straight rounds. He did a really good job against Billy Joe Saunders, cutting the ring off and countering him. Same thing with Caleb Plant. We've seen him do it time and time again to very good top fighters, 168 pounds. Crawford is not natural 168 pounds. I know he's strong, I know he's a great athlete, but I don't think he's... I think Crawford's game, and what we've learned about from the Madrimov fight, is that if he can't get a knockout, his victory is not clean at all, right? The last time we saw that really was with Victor Postol, who ironically fights quite similarly to Israel Madrimov, which I think explains why the fight went the distance. Now, Madrimov is not the only fighter to take rounds away from Crawford early on. Almost every Crawford opponent has done that before. If he fights someone pretty good, he will definitely lose some rounds at least. There's usually such a short window of a fight being close with Crawford in the first few rounds to it being completely one-sided. Once Crawford flips the switch, I think it's given us this false sense of him being unbeatable, the idea that he could flip that switch against any boxer ever. I definitely don't think he could against Canelo, because not only does Canelo have a really good chin and he's 168 pounds, his defence is great. So there's not even a chance of maybe he gets a lucky punch in or starts landing too much outboxing him. Canelo, with his absolute size, he will start pushing Crawford around the ring pretty easily. At a certain point, you just can't outpoint someone like that who's landing massive blows. Even if it isn't landing clean, Canelo's hooks on the guard of Crawford will be hurting him, causing damage, scoring points, compared to Crawford's little tippy-tappy blows on the guard of Canelo. Now, to be fair, Canelo can be a slow starter too. He's not the only one out of the two of them who starts slow in fights, but I think he would be forced to take an early lead, just like he did with Jermell Charlo, which is how I see the fight going, really. Jermell Charlo is bigger than Crawford, right? And we saw how that fight goes. I know he's not as good as Crawford, but we saw how the fight went. Anyway, moving on, we have a fighter whose placement could age either really well or really terribly after their fight on this Saturday against Serhii Bohachuk. We have Vergil Ortiz Jr. Now, I'd actually argue that he's got a better chance versus Bud than Boots does right now. Even though stylistically I do think Boots has the better style to beat Crawford as the boxer who keeps himself at range. Crawford, being a counter-puncher, will always be favoured against an aggressive boxer. But I feel like since Vergil's got a really good jab, and he's not just a one-dimensional pressure boxer, he's very calculated with what he does. I do like his chances over Bud Crawford, right? Because he's very, very good. I think he's got one of the best ceilings, some of the highest potential out of any boxer right now. Because if you consider him as a boxer, right, he's aggressive. He's got very good shot selection. He throws to the body, throws to the head. An aggressive boxer with a jab, tight defence. He can slip, he can counter. He's got good head movement, a great guard, great timing, great reflexes, and he's got 100% KO ratio, right? What more do you want from Vergil Ortiz, really? Because he's very, very good. Now, the only detriment I can see to Vergil as a boxer is his health issues, obviously, which led to a bit of a delay in his career last year. But as far as I'm aware, as far as I'm concerned, he's back. He's up and running. If we get a healthy Vergil Ortiz, I think he can surpass Crawford. I think him or Boots will be the one to surpass Crawford or take his 0, in my opinion, unless Canelo gets there first. I believe they will be one of them two will do it, in my opinion. Moving on back down the list, we have Tszyu. Now, he was on track to be the one to fight Crawford in a big unification fight, but that big cut he suffered on his forehead versus Fundora really did derail those plans. So that was unfortunate for him. I still think he's better than Fundora, and I still think he's got a reasonably good chance over Bud. I believe Tszyu would beat Madrimov, but I don't think he would do better than Madrimov did against Bud. Because, like I said earlier, stylistically, Crawford is the counterpuncher, and maybe the best counterpuncher in boxing. Tszyu's a very strictly pressure boxer, so as a style it doesn't really work for Tszyu, but from what he does, Tszyu is really, really good. In my opinion, he's like to draw a comparison for Tszyu, he's like a more technical beterbiev. So he's a great boxer, very calculated pressure, but I just don't think he's I don't think he could box on the front foot versus Crawford for 12 rounds without getting knocked down at least a few times. He got knocked down by Terrell Gachier. Crawford can do the same thing. The next placement on the list, I think a lot of people will be confused by because he shouldn't really be on the list. He's not an active boxer. We have Manny Pacquiao. Now, I'm sure 99% of you people know that Crawford would beat the hell out of Pacquiao and it wouldn't be close whatsoever. But there'll be one or two little Filipino boys who just still have this idea that Pacquiao beats everyone if he just takes it seriously, right? Silliness. I don't think I need to expand on it whatsoever. Dennis Ugas is just a low-budget version of Terence Crawford, and he beat Pacquiao pretty convincingly about 3 years ago. If that fight happened now, it would be a slaughter, and it wouldn't be close at all. It's a shame, but he's 46? There's no way he's winning that fight, come on. We have a fight who I think is very underrated in the conversation of boxers who could beat Crawford, and that is Janibek. Now, the reason probably is that the obvious reason that he's not really being mentioned is because he's at 160, and that's not Crawford's division yet. But the fact that people are jumping all the way up to Canelo but never talking about 160, I think is a bit of an oversight. I can see Crawford getting a bit too big for his boots if he ends up clearing out 154 and just moving straight up to 160, jumping into a fight with Janibek and probably losing, to be honest. Knowing that the Canelo fight's on the horizon, he'd probably lose to Janibek, personally. Because Janibek's a very dangerous fight for him. I think stylistically as well. Because a pattern we've noticed is that the Kazakh style, the Soviet in and out boxing, stiff punches, upright head movement sort of style, that has given Crawford issues in the past. Victor Postol survived 12 rounds with him because of that. Israel Madrimov survived 12 rounds and made it close with him because of that. Because the thing with them two is they're never too stuck in the mud, but they're also not moving too much either. Right, they're always like sort of making it difficult for Crawford to find his timing, for him to get his counters going, to work on a still opponent. If someone's moving in and out, never quite in one direction, it makes it very difficult for a counter puncher to gauge when to start punching. And Janibek is a very good fighter in that regard, because not only with the movement, he's also a very dangerous puncher, and he's got a very considerable height and reach advantage over Crawford, which would make it very difficult for him. I actually lean Janibek to beat Crawford personally. I just think that regardless of the difference of the boxing skill on display, I think stylistically it's a bit of a nightmare for Crawford, and just the reach would really throw him off, and I think he'd end up with a points win for Janibek personally. Moving on to a fighter who I think's been a bit forgotten really in these discussions, we have Charlo. Very quick fall from grace this guy's had really, because he was undisputed in 2022 when he knocked out Brian Castano. Height of his career, all the hype was on him, and then he just decided, you know what, I'm going to not fight for a full year, move up 2 weight classes out of nowhere, fight Canelo, lose, get beat up, and then never fight again. He's not been seen since. Now, is he still good? Maybe. We actually don't know, because I don't think he'll... Knowing Charlo, I don't really think he'll be very motivated to come back for a Crawford fight, really. He's had his Canelo payday. He's had plenty of paydays in his career. He's become undisputed. I'd be very surprised if he actually went for a campaign to get undisputed again, even though because he's already done it. I don't think he'd want to do it again. He'll probably fight again, most likely against Crawford, maybe against a guy like Fundora, who knows. But against Crawford, he's at the bottom of the decent chance tier, because I think as a style to beat Crawford, I don't think Crawford will have an easy time with him. Charlo, even though he's not a great boxer, he's very well-rounded, right? He can box and he can punch at the same time, which is dangerous for someone who's not a natural fighter at 154 pounds. But the levels of boxing on display, really, and obviously the inactivity, the career trajectories of the two, you've got to lean Crawford. We move on to the final place on the list. Serhii Bohachuk. Now, he's only really relevant if he beats Vergil Ortiz this Saturday. If he doesn't, then forget about him, really. I don't think he'll ever win a title. But assuming he beats Vergil Ortiz, he jumps right up those rankings very quickly, right? Because winning that fight would surprise a lot of people. Unless Vergil's kidneys just explode mid-fight and he loses that way. If he beats Vergil Ortiz, that's a massive statement, and I think would put him on notice as a potential he could beat Crawford opponent. But as of right now, I don't think he beats Vergil Ortiz. I think he'll get knocked out in that fight. We saw him knocked out already. His defence isn't great. He's a bit slow. He clearly punches really hard. He's got the artur beterbiev effect of looking a bit laboured and slow, but you can tell he punches really hard. I don't think he's at a beterbiev. I think he's just a good pressure boxer, but he's not brilliant. He'd get knocked out by Crawford with a good counter, a good check hook, maybe an uppercut. Who knows? That does it for the video. If you disagree, leave a comment.